So it is my great pleasure to bring to the podium our first speaker, Amanda Moranzan, a clinical psychologist and an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at Lakehead University. Her research focuses on mental illness, stigma, and stigma reduction strategies and help seeking, especially amongst post-secondary individuals. So thank you, Amanda.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I've hidden away some notes here, if I can get them to work. So I thought that I would start today by giving an overview of mental illness stigma. Many will be familiar with the concept, so I'll try to keep that part brief. And then I will speak about what we know about stigma, as well as what we don't know as it pertains to gender. So give me a moment here to get oriented. Here, I thought I'd be sneaky to hide my notes away. It's taking me a while. Okay, so stigma is a topic of emotional or enormous importance due to the high personal, social, as well as economic costs associated with it. It's a significant concern for people who live with a mental illness, as well as their family members, healthcare providers, and policymakers. Of the estimated 2.6 million Canadians that will experience a mental health and substance use problem, only about 1/3 will receive some form of healthcare contact, due in part to the stigma surrounding mental illness. Approximately 1 in 5 Canadians with a mental health concern believe that they need treatment, but will not seek it out due to fears of what others might think. So stigma has a direct interference with healthcare seeking. It also influences the timeliness of seeking help. So recent research shows that the average length of time between contacting a health professional is 1 year for psychotic disorders, 8 years for mood disorders, and 9 years for anxiety disorders. There's also been a lot of research looking at the economic costs associated with stigma. It was estimated to be upwards of $20 billion in 2012 in Canada, and this is projected to grow to almost $30 billion by the year 2030 in Canada. So it has this direct effect on treatment seeking and adherence. It results in the prolonged suffering and increased burden of disease for people with a mental illness. And recent data suggest that this is an ongoing concern within Canada. So only 50% of Canadians would tell a friend or a coworker that they have a family member with a mental health problem. Only 42% are unsure that they would socialize with somebody with a mental illness, and about half would be unlikely to partner with somebody who has a mental health concern. So I've taken this graphic. This is something that is often used on an edition of Irving Goffman's seminal book on stigma called Stigma: Notes on the Management of Spoiled Identity. And he first describes stigma as an attribute that is deeply discrediting, which makes the person different from other people, not quite human and of a less desirable kind, is how he described it. Social cognitive models of stigma often look at the constellation of negative thoughts, emotions, and behaviors directed towards persons with a mental illness by the public. Most of the research looks at public stigma, but there's also a literature looking at healthcare professionals' attitudes about mental health, as well as people with mental illness themselves. The more commonly used terms that we're more familiar with are stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. So when we're talking about mental illness stigma, the most common stereotype is that people with a mental illness are dangerous. But other common stereotypes are the belief that people are irresponsible, that they're unproductive, unpredictable, that they're unattractive, or that they're responsible or to blame for their illness. Prejudice, or the emotional component, are feelings such as fear, anxiety, irritation, and uneasiness, whether in the company of somebody with a mental health condition or when we're asked to imagine. And then finally, discrimination. So examples of discrimination of people with mental illness are things like segregation from society, withholding help or opportunities, coercive treatments, and avoidance of contact. And discrimination is often conceptualized as social distancing, wanting to physically separate ourselves from an individual with a mental health concern. And in stigma research, we often measure this by asking people to rate the degree to which they would be comfortable interacting with somebody with a mental illness, so hypothetically. So common endorsements are things like refusing to rent a room, unwillingness to have somebody as a coworker, a neighbor, or a child caretaker, refusal to be involved in a romantic relationship, unwillingness to recommend for employment. And more extreme examples are things like revoking driving license, denying the right to vote, and recommending women with mental illness have abortions. Naturalistic studies have also found a lot of social distance and real-world discriminatory acts against people with a mental illness, so things like refusing to rent accommodation, fewer job offers, and more false charges for violent offenses. When we're talking about stigma, probably we're mainly thinking about public stigma. This is the general negative attitude towards mental illness that members of the public have. But there are also other related forms of stigma. Self-stigma, sometimes called internalized stigma, exists when an individual with a mental health condition internalizes public attitudes and applies it towards themselves. Structural stigma occurs when there's inequitable social or institutional policies that adversely affect somebody with a mental illness. And then stigma by association is sometimes called courtesy stigma, but this occurs when a family member or somebody who's close to that individual is stigmatized only because of their connection to that individual. So there are many factors that influence stigma and stigma towards mental illness specifically. But looking at the research, gender is something that is rarely acknowledged to be one of them. There have been very few attempts to understand stigma-related problems, particularly in the context of women's mental health. This is seen as a relatively new area of research. So we don't know a lot about how stigma interacts with gender, but we do know quite a bit about how gender influences these other areas that are related to stigma. If we want to understand relationships between gender and stigma, we need to first understand the overall attitudes towards men and women and how they differ. There's been a lot of research showing that attitudes towards men and women do differ quite significantly. So for example, the stereotyping research consistently shows that people have an overall perception of men as strong, as assertive, and of women as being sensitive and warm. Men are viewed as high in competence but low in warmth, women the opposite. And cross-cultural research shows a women are wonderful effect, where we tend to give global overall evaluations of women as more positive compared to men. Men receive these overall negative global evaluations. And these stereotypes and gender roles play into other stereotypes that exist, for example, with mental illness. So we actually tend to view certain mental disorders as gendered. Substance use disorders, antisocial personality disorder, among others, tend to be seen as stereotypically masculine disorders. Depression, eating disorders, histrionic personality disorders tend to be seen as stereotypically feminine disorders. And as a group, the masculine disorders are more heavily stigmatized. It's thought because of the overall negative valuing of, the overall negative attitudes towards men that play towards the stigmatization of these disorders. But men and women within these stereotypically masculine disorders will be stigmatized at similar rates. This also plays into what we know about diagnosis and treatment. There's lots of research showing if you give the same clinical information but vary the gender of the individual, clinicians will arrive at two different diagnoses based on our stereotypical views of symptoms as well as what diagnoses men and women receive. And this also plays into help seeking. The World Health Organization recently concluded that gender stereotypes around proneness to emotional distress for women and alcohol problems in men reinforce social stigma, and they constrain help seeking along these stereotypical lines. It's a barrier to the accurate identification of mental health needs in women as well as men, and a barrier to their effective treatment. So the stigma research has begun to try to understand a few questions. First of all, are there gender differences in attitudes towards mental illness? The first review to look at this was done in the 1980s by Farina. And at that point, he concluded that there weren't any overall differences in terms of people's attitudes around men's and women's attitudes about mental illness. There didn't seem to be any differences there. More recent research has been more mixed. There haven't been consistent findings across studies for gender, as well as for any other demographic correlates. One potential reason is that when we're measuring stigma, we're often measuring different types of stigma. There's a little bit of research suggesting that perhaps women are less likely to endorse discriminatory acts towards people with mental illness compared to men, but other research has looked at mental health literacy, social distance, and attitudes. So really mixed findings due in part to what we're measuring, and we tend to ask about mental illness in general rather than looking at specific disorders. There's also some research looking at anti-stigma campaigns. Does gender influence respond to anti-stigma initiatives? And this would be very important for programs that are wanting to change public attitudes or healthcare attitudes and behavior towards people with a mental illness. There's a little bit of research suggesting that contact might be more effective for women versus men. But again, a lot more research needed before we have any definitive findings here. And then finally, how do women experience mental illness stigma? This is an important question that needs to be addressed. How does being female intersect with mental illness stigma? Women experience stigma differently. One example from the research looks at public perceptions that associate alcohol use with sexual promiscuity for women, but not for men. So women who seek treatment for alcohol use also have to face this stereotype of sexual promiscuity, which again limits treatment seeking. Other research has looked at stigma experienced by pregnant women and mothers who smoke, use alcohol, or illicit substances. A recent study found that 70% of women with a peripartum mood disorder downplay their symptoms to their healthcare provider because of stigma. And again, we're very concerned about this because of the cost to the individual, as well as the barrier to treatment that it presents. So stigma researchers need to do a lot of things differently. There is a huge need for us to engage in sex and gender-based analysis. This is something that is typically missing in the stigma research. We also need to go beyond differences and look to mechanisms, be more specific in our research, and examine stigma's interaction with other aspects of diversity. So clearly we have a lot of work to do. To create real change for people who are living with a mental illness, it's crucial that we better understand gender's role in the way that stigma is experienced as well as applied. And practitioners and researchers can benefit from sensitivity to this intersectional stigma, the overlapping multiple levels of stigma that women with mental illness face. This is important for stigma reduction strategies, but it's also important to create social and economic change for women who are living with a mental illness. Thanks.
Our second presenter is Dr. Suzanne Stewart, who I'm going to invite to come to the podium. Suzanne is the director of the Waakeben S. Bryce Institute for Indigenous Health and associate professor at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. And her research focuses on Indigenous mental health and healing in psychology, Indigenous pedagogies in higher education, Indigenous ethics, and research methodologies. So thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you for having me. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the land that we're on, the Mohawk and Anishinaabe people who've recently caretaken the traditional Indigenous land that we're visiting if we're not Anishinaabe or Mohawk from the Six Nations of the Grand River or the Mississaugas of the New Credit. So I'd like to thank them. I'd also like to acknowledge the funders and the partnerships who've made the body of my work possible. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what we're going to talk about in the next few minutes so that you have an idea. Because when people hear the word Indigenous or they hear the word reconciliation, they get a little bit scared. And I think that's because people don't know what that means, and they don't know what that's going to happen, and they don't know how that's going to affect them. So we're going to talk a little bit about who Indigenous people are, what the status of Indigenous people is today, and how that was created through colonization. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what that means in the context of mental health and healing and education as part of the larger backdrop. And then we're going to talk a little bit about, all in 15 minutes or less, about what this reconciliation is and what it really means to all of us. So who are Indigenous people? This is a very common, basic information that most people in Canada don't know. If I were just to randomly poll people here, I could guarantee that I would get answers like, if I were to ask people how many Indigenous people are in Canada, I would get answers that ranged from 150,000 to 6 million, suggesting that most Canadians don't know. According to Stats Canada, there's about 1.5 million Indigenous people. That's according to the census and other forms of data collection. Indigenous communities believe that number is wrong and represents about half of the number of Indigenous people who are here. The other big mystery to Canadians, that is non-Indigenous Canadians, because Indigenous people don't consider themselves to be Canadian. That's an immigrant's construct of who lives in this country. Indigenous people are comprised of 3 groups of original people, 3 distinct cultural identities. The First Nations, who are status and non-status Indians. The Métis, a distinct cultural group created from the intermarriage of the James Bay Cree Indians and the French fur trappers. And the third group are the Inuit, and those are the Indigenous or original peoples from the far north. Completely different to First Nations, completely different to Métis. And within First Nations, for example, there's much within group difference because there's dozens of First Nations groups across Canada, each with different languages and different customs and different cultures. So when we talk about Indigenous people, it's important to understand that Indigenous people have experienced multiple, what I call colonial aggressions and assaults that have been both systemic and extremely personal. And a couple of the large examples of this are that education has been used as a tool of oppression against Indigenous people, and that other systems such as child welfare, the justice system, healthcare and mental health, and segregation have also been intrusive and extremely personal ways that Canada has subjugated and oppressed Indigenous people, beginning prior to the 1800s, but systemically by law in the 1800s, and continuing up until currently and today. The second important piece to understanding the context of mental health for Indigenous people is to understand that education and health both continue to be systems that perpetrate harms and oppressions on Indigenous people today. So I'm going to explain this a little bit in very brief terms. Many people seem to know what residential school is. Most people don't really understand what it is. It was an extensive school system that was set up by the Canadian government across the country and administered by churches. Residential school was something that was one of the policies of a larger law that built Canada that's called the Indian Act. And the Indian Act was created to exterminate Indigenous people in order to make room and space for white settlers from Europe to come and create their towns, their villages, their schools, their businesses, and their uses of natural resources to support their lifestyle in the new country. So the Indian Act established federal policies that did many things. Residential school was just one of those. Some of the other things that the Indian Act created and enforced, and many of these continue to be enforced today, were the creation of reserves, so moving Indigenous people to separated land tracts that were not deemed habitable for white settlers. Women didn't have status in society and weren't allowed to vote until the 70s or 80s, depending on what region that they lived in. And if you left the reserve where you were forced to go live, you lost your status as an Indian. And you weren't allowed to go to university or go to schools outside of the residential school and that sort of thing. There are many policies of the Indian Act, and I'm not going to read them all to you, but what's important to understand is that they denied health and education as it was traditionally offered to Indigenous people. So traditional forms of education and health were made illegal, and Western forms of substandard health and education were enforced and put on to Indigenous people, and many other things, as you can see. So to focus a little bit on residential school, because that's a big issue when we talk about mental health. So residential school had a goal of forcibly removing children from their families and isolating them from their culture and their communities in order to move ahead this process of national assimilation and extermination that the federal government had. And the federal government believed that the best way to destroy a culture and a people was to take away the children and to destroy the family. So they did that, and there's a lot of research was done since 2006, because prior to 2006, residential school was not mentioned in Canada, and it wasn't mentioned by anyone who went there. The Indian Act stated that the goal of residential school was to kill the Indian in the child, and this was based on the national policies of federal Canada that Indigenous cultural beliefs and values and ways of living were inferior to Euro-Canadian Christian ones. So here's a picture from the Archives of Canada showing the success of the residential school. More success pictures. In 2008, our then Prime Minister made a public apology to Indigenous people under pressure and persecution by the United Nations, who brought various human rights charges against Canada because of the Indian Act and because of residential schools. So it wasn't like Canada decided, you know, we feel bad about this. They were forced to do this by the United Nations. And part of his larger apology said that today we recognize that this policy of assimilation was wrong and caused great harm and has no place in our country. And some of the research that came out after that apology that happened through the striking of what the federal government called its Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which had a purpose of investigating the impacts of residential school on the health, the well-being, and the work-life outcomes of Indigenous people today. So some of that research showed that 150,000 students went to residential school during the times they were open. The last one closed in the 1990s. They have records of 3,000 children who died, and of those records, 500 of those children didn't have identities. Disease was the major killer, followed by exposure, drowning, malnutrition, because children weren't fed, clothed, or kept warm in most cases, and that they weren't educated. Many children came out functionally illiterate or unable to do any kind of academic work. They were mostly used for domestic labor training. And many children were victims of physical and sexual abuse and assault, and many children also died by suicide or trying to run away. So in the field of mental health, so I'm a clinical psychologist who works in the Aboriginal community, and I do research in mental health. And you know, one of the things that we talk about in mental health is trauma. Trauma is the big ticket talk in the Indigenous community, especially intergenerational trauma. And when we talk about intergenerational trauma for Indigenous people, we're really talking about an original trauma that happened in residential school or in the child welfare system and that was passed on through generations. And when people experience intergenerational trauma that's passed on, the trauma that they experience currently, or bad things that might happen to them, to use less deficit-based language, then that gets compounded on what's happened earlier in life or even in previous generations. And that's what we're really facing with the mental health status of Indigenous people, because right now in Canada, Indigenous populations have a 100% survivorship of abuse of some kind. So every Indigenous person that you meet has experienced abuse because of colonial systemic policies, either directly or indirectly. So for example, I'm the single mom of 4 children, and my children range in age from 7 to 18. My children are the first generation in my family not to go to residential school. A 7-year-old represents the first generation not to go to residential school. So this isn't something that happened hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago. This is something that's happening and affects people now, the mental health of women and children. And particularly when we think about this history, you can only imagine what the reserves and the villages felt like with all the children gone for many generations, and people's traditional ways of life and healing resources made against the law. What did people have left to deal with? So the Indian Act outlawed traditional Indigenous healing practices, and this systemic legal change effectively made the way that we practiced health and wellness for ourselves and our communities illegal, and gave us these other ways, these Western medical ways, that didn't really work for our people and really was antithetical to our worldviews on what health and healing are. So when we look at the, you're going to give me another thing that says 1 minute, 0 minutes? 2 minutes, okay. So when we look at this history of colonization and the impacts that it has on Indigenous populations as a population, we begin to understand that the system of Canada and the creation of Canada has subjugated Indigenous people to be harmed by the creation and the laws that made where everybody else lives possible. And when we look at the social determinants of health, which are, and what are the actual major determinants of health for Indigenous people, we look at all the stuff that's connected to these colonial policies. And that leaves me and Dr. Shaw, who I've worked with for many years, who used to be a doctor at Anishinaabe Health and who was a professor of public health at Dalai Lama, one of the first non-Indigenous people who brought Indigenous issues to the fore of public health and medicine, that health for Indigenous people and Indigenous women in particular is actually a political construct and not a biological or technical process. And this has many implications for how we begin to understand and work with mental health problems, which isn't even part of the Indigenous paradigm, to say that problems exist. Because we don't have words for mental illness or problem in our languages, in all of our languages. So thank you.
I'm now going to introduce Dr. Simone Vigod. Simone is a psychiatrist, a scientist here at Women's College Research Institute and the lead of the Reproductive Life Stages program here. She is an assistant, soon to be promoted associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto, and her research focuses primarily on epidemiology and the treatment of women with mental health issues across the lifespan. Thank you, Simone.
Thank you, Dr. Mason, for this opportunity to speak to this group. Certainly, I have to take a moment because I think Dr. Stewart's words were a tough act to follow. But I also think that in some respects, what I'm going to speak to you about actually has relation to gender and mental illness stigma, and also has relation to some of the concepts that Dr. Stewart touched on, and in particular related to intergenerational trauma. So what I'm going to speak to you about today is the concept of mental health as it relates to the time around pregnancy. I'm sure that people in the audience have heard the term postpartum depression. Yes. Postpartum depression, in my mind, though, has it's excellent that it's gotten the focus that it has. But I think it's important to highlight that, in some respects, postpartum depression is a euphemism, or has become a euphemism for each of the issues related to mental health and addictions that can occur around the time of pregnancy. So what I thought I would do is start with giving you a background about what some of the mental health issues are that can occur around the time of pregnancy, and what some of the barriers are to optimizing mental health around the time of pregnancy. I'm going to focus on women, but as this is a women's mental health topic, but I think we should all keep in our minds that people who are not women, other men or anyone else of any sex or gender can also suffer from a mental health issue around the time of pregnancy and postpartum. And then I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking to you about a new initiative that has been bubbling to the surface in the context of some of the challenges of getting people and women the help that they need. And I'm going to tell you about our new initiative, but I'm going to tell you about it in the context of what we think we want to do, and then talk to you about some of the academic and research methods that we're going to use to get there. And then I'm hoping that on some level that can inform part of our panel discussion afterward, because I think what I will talk to you about is how much it speaks to the fact that we cannot just take a top-down approach to decide, me as the psychiatrist who works in this lovely building gets to decide what all of the community needs. And so it's for those reasons that I think that even though the topics that we've all spoken about are a little bit different, they really do all relate to each other. So, postpartum mental health issues. The most common mental health issues that occur during pregnancy and postpartum are in the mood and anxiety spectrum. Does someone want to hazard a guess if what epidemiology suggests, what the population-based surveys suggest in terms of women within the first year postpartum have significant anxiety, depressive symptoms that actually impact their ability to function? Anyone want to hazard a guess? What kind of numbers we're talking about? Hazard a guess what the sort of epidemiological services say? Because your point is correct, right? Everyone has adjustment and issues, but people who might actually require symptom-based treatment.
1 in 5.
Where's that?
1 in 5.
Yeah. It's actually estimated that when you put anxiety, depressive symptoms together, and we're talking clinically significant ones, not just some difficulty transient adjustment, we're talking about 1 in 5 people, so 20% of people. Does anyone know how common conditions like gestational diabetes are?
1 in 10.
It's lower, right? It's probably, 2-3%. What about a condition like preeclampsia? Does anyone know how common that is? 1 in 100. Yeah, 1 in 100, okay? So we're talking about conditions that are 20 times more common than some of the conditions that get screened for and are taken seriously during pregnancy and postpartum. So, is mental health not as important? Does it not have as big an impact as something like preeclampsia or as gestational diabetes? No, I mean, I think there's quite good evidence to suggest that the impact of untreated or undertreated depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms can have quite significant impact. They can have impact for the mother in terms of continuing on and having chronic mental health problems. They can have impact for the relationships in the family, and they can have impact on a developing fetus and developing child. To the extent that untreated postpartum depressive symptoms are associated with problems such as delayed language development in a child, delayed social emotional development, behavioral problems, and the later development not only of psychiatric disorders but of adjustment in life. And this is actually in some respects where we're starting to really hear about the concept of intergenerational passage of mental health issues, intergenerational trauma. So there are about 400,000 births in Canada every year. If 20% of people are affected, then we're talking about 80,000 children and mothers each year who are affected by mental health issues around the time of pregnancy. Here's the problem, though. The other work that we've done and that others have done from an epidemiological perspective is that fewer than 1 in 5 of these women actually get effective treatment, meaning treatment that is adequate to reduce their symptoms and increase their quality of life. That's abysmal, right? That means 80% of that 80,000 people are untreated. Sure, are some of these people going to get better on their own? Maybe, but the majority are going to be at risk for all of those negative outcomes. So what are the reasons why people don't receive treatment? Am I allowed to let people call out? So stigma is absolutely at the forefront. And I really liked Dr. Maranzan's, I'm going to say your name wrong, slide that was talking about the self-stigma, because that really spoke to me. And I think it's actually important to distinguish that, right? There's the public stigma, and the maybe partner stigma or family stigma, but then there's also the self-stigma. And that's not just a knowledge-based issue with people, but it's a societally based issue with people. And so that's something that we have to think about and we have to address. When you think about a woman, I see women often in my own clinic who are 8 or 9 months postpartum who've been suffering from the middle of their pregnancy. And why didn't they come? Related to stigma, related to not even wanting to bring it up with their doctor. I saw a woman recently who wrote her doctor a letter and delivered it to her doctor in a closed envelope because and then the doctor read it and referred her. But she was so embarrassed that this is what was happening to her that she couldn't go in and speak to her doctor. What else is a problem for treatment?
Geographical location.
So are our services set up to serve people where they are, right? And what happens when you're pregnant and you're trying to work and you're trying to get in your hours so that you can get your employment insurance? Like, can you leave work in the middle of the day for psychotherapy, right? What about when you're postpartum and somebody says, I don't know how many people have had little babies in the audience, but someone says, okay, so every Tuesday at 4, you need to come for an hour of therapy. Right? Or we're only running that group at 2, right? These are real problems, right? And so there's a lot of talk about how come often people go to drugs or medication before therapy, right? It may be that therapy is not available in your area, that even if it's down the street, you can't get there, right? Because of timing, et cetera. And so those are I would say that there are these kind of stigma-based barriers, which also relate to shame-based barriers. And then there are these very, very practical barriers. Maybe there's not something in your region, or maybe there is, but because of some unique things around the postpartum time period. So, So there are a lot of practical-based barriers, some of which are individual, some of which are system-based, right, if you don't have the expertise in your area.
Hello.
Yeah.
What about precarity? Because another thing that we touch, a lot of women live in precarious circumstances where they're not able to have the access to these services, and there's a great multiple amount of women who are affected in that way.
Yeah, so it goes even beyond that, right? It goes, you might not have the TTC tokens to get there. You might not have someone to watch your other children, right?
Non-immigrant women as well
Pardon?
who are living under these marginalized circumstances, non-documented, non-immigrant.
So one piece of our research that we did from an epidemiological perspective not too long ago is that we looked at women who, you'll find this interesting, so we looked at women who showed up to an emergency department postpartum. And we looked at the proportion of those women who showed up in the emergency room for a mental health problem, but who hadn't seen any physician for a mental health issue between the delivery and showing up in the emergency room. And so these women weren't showing up 5 days postpartum, right? They were showing up 5 months postpartum, so plenty of time for them. And yes, there are other healthcare providers, but if you're showing up in an emerge, that's pretty serious. You would think you would have needed to see a physician, potentially. Okay, so how many? 60% of the women showing up in the emerge had not seen a physician, and guess who was at most risk? Women who are living in marginalized communities, who are materially deprived, women living in rural areas, women of low socioeconomic status. So you are absolutely right. So in the 4 minutes that I have left, the question is, what are the solutions? So working with some of the other expert perinatal programs across the University of Toronto, including Sinai Health System and Sunnybrook Health Sciences Centre, where we have the clinical expertise to be treating some of these conditions, we've developed this idea called MOVE-IN, which we are terming the Maternal Mental Health of Ontario Virtual Intervention Network. And the idea is to build an intervention network, a virtual arm of our programs that can go against some of these barriers at each level of these barriers and improve access, improve safety, improve efficiency, essentially improve quality and improve outcomes. So the general idea is that we want this to be patient-facing, because if women can't or don't want to or feel uncomfortable going into their healthcare providers, we want them to have a way to access at least some services where they don't have to, to get around some of these stigma-based issues. So a patient-facing site that could actually triage people to say, okay, you have mildish symptoms, so here's some education, here's some self-guided cognitive behavior therapy, or we have here at Women's College a program called Mother Matters, which is open to all of Ontario. It's facilitated by our psychotherapists. It's a group that women can post on anytime, 24/7, right? But it's moderated by trained therapists and delivers education, right? So any woman all over the province could do that. What if she needs more? Then, if a woman needs more, we would actually want to direct her to an evidence-based psychotherapist, again, virtually. What if she needs more than that? At that point, we would want to be facilitating connection with her family physician, who could get access to one of us as a specialist, or even to get virtual psychiatric care. And the thing is, all of these types of interventions exist. Some have been evaluated, some of them haven't. One thing that really hasn't been done is we haven't really gone to the community and said, well, we think this makes sense, but do you think this makes sense? Would this work? So where we're starting now is we're embarking on a discovery process to say, we think this is what MOVE-IN should look like, but what do you think MOVE-IN should look like? And then we're going to go through an iterative design process until we can build a platform that can smoothly move women through to match the resources that they get to their needs. And I think that the biggest thing about this is the idea is that this is not just going to be a pilot project that's going to fall flat, right? That's why where the academics come in, that we actually have to be systematic about it, and we have to evaluate at each level of the process, are we improving access? Are we improving efficiency? Are we improving safety? And are we ultimately improving outcomes for mothers, their partners, and for their children, and reducing the burden of these very, very common disorders on the population of Canada. So I was only over by like 10 seconds, right?
Thank you, Simone, and for getting us moving in the direction of interventions, which is going to be the subject of our second panel. I'm going to invite Suzanne and Amanda to join Suzanne up here by the mics while we take a few minutes for some questions that I hope are going to inspire some cross-dialogue for you. So my first question is actually directed to all of you, and it's that in our Euro-Canadian, European, North American history, mental illness has such a long association with stigma. I wonder what factors you think, historical, social, medical, are allowing us at this moment in history to be thinking about that stigma and trying to address it. And Suzanne and Amanda, I might ask you to comment first.
Stigma expert.
Sure. Well, that's a really big question.
I only do big questions.
Yeah, I guess to try to be concise, it's the distinction between us and them. There's been a lot of research looking at diagnosis and labeling, but I think in order for a group to be stigmatized or marginalized, there's the distinction between us and the others. And there's also a significant power differential between us and them. So I think to be concise, it's this separation between ourselves and members of a marginalized group, and then the subsequent loss of power.
And why then do you think that we were able to knock down some of those barriers at this moment? What has facilitated our ability to do that?
Can I
Yeah,
answer
go ahead.
what I think? As not a stigma expert, but as someone who sees this as it plays out, and then you can tell me if you think that I'm totally off base. So, you know, in order to, like, I actually think that we're listening better. I think that we're listening better to each other. You know, a colleague of mine in the UK is developing a self-guided or a therapist-guided cognitive behavioral therapy program for women with mild to moderate struggles with mood and anxiety in the perinatal period. And so they went through a really interesting process. And initially, the title of their book was called, I don't know, Mental Disorders in Postpartum or something like that. Now, the title of the book, because of what the community said would be most comfortable, is well-being of women in the perinatal period. Guess what? The content is the same, really, right? But it was reframed in a way that actually made it possible to talk about. So I think it's good that we're talking. I think we need to do more listening, because we're still not quite there yet. You know, I was at a dinner. It was like a fundraising dinner, but it was very corporate. It was an oil company dinner, and Sophie Trudeau was like the keynote, and she talked about the fact. She said, you know, it's okay for the politician's wife to say that she has a mental health issue. It's actually okay for Stephen Page, who was one of the other keynotes, a musician, to say that he has a mental health issue. But how about all of you CEOs in the room? How okay is it for you to stand up and say that you have a mental health issue? And she said that she thinks that's where, like, we've come a ways, but we still have a ways to go.
Thank you. Suzanne, I wanted to ask you a particular question, given the historical framing of mental health challenges being a very sort of westernized concept. Can you tell us a little bit from a historical perspective what an Indigenous thinking about mental states looked like?
So in Indigenous paradigms, so meaning worldviews and knowledges and ways of living, health is understood through through a wellness focus, as opposed to Western ideology, which sees health through a deficit or disease lens based on that worldview and way of thinking. So Indigenous mental health is defined as balance between and within the four aspects of the self: the mental, the physical, the spiritual, and the emotional. And there's no word for disease in our languages, and there's no word for sickness. The words that exist in all the different languages represent concepts such as balance and relationship and understanding. Those are the sort of things, those are the ways that Western illness are understood in terms of being out of balance. And to kind of put that in the broader terms of the first question that was talked about a few minutes ago, I don't really think the stigma of health or mental health has been addressed for Indigenous women who are consistently subjugated by white privileged women who dominate the field of healthcare and mental health care, bringing these Western ideologies of what health and wellness and treatment are. So for instance, Western evidence-based practices of mental health don't make sense to Indigenous women or Indigenous people. Why? Because they're so heavily focused on one aspect of functioning and really don't pay attention to the integral aspect of what health is for Indigenous people, and that is spirituality. For Indigenous peoples, not just in Canada, but all over the world, all healing begins with the spiritual. And illness is understood through a spiritual framework, not a religious framework, not a colonial framework, not an oppressive framework, a framework that understands about who you are, what your meaning and purpose are in life, and how that connects to how you function. That's what health and wellness is from many Indigenous perspectives around the world. And I would say everyone sitting here listening can feel some connection to themselves around what that means to understand that all illness and all sickness and all healing begins with the spiritual, because that transcends what happens biologically or what happens as that technical process. Just because the symptoms go away doesn't mean the illness goes away. And that's an oversight by the Western approaches to mental health. And I've been working as a clinical psychologist for many years. And of course we need to work with the symptoms and alleviating those problems and dealing with that. But what we really need to look at is, what does that mean to that person? How do they function at that deeper level of meaning that is what really mediates what happens to us mentally, emotionally, physically?
Thank you. It reminds me of something, just to bring it back to sort of perceptions of others and the stigma and innovations in stigma. It reminds me of something that I read that said the problem with the stigma around mental illness has to do with the stories we tell ourselves as a society. So I'm wondering what strategies we might think about in acting to change those stories.
You asking me?
I'm asking all of you. I didn't think it would be a simple answer.
You know, Dr. Stewart's comment, I mean, when I think about what you said, that's what I'm trying to do in psychotherapy with any patient, regardless of their background. But I think what you just called out is this really kind of strange tension with, like, sort of corporate mental health care, right? Like that you have to assign a diagnosis, that a medication could just, treat a symptom, or even that like a short therapy, like a cognitive behavior therapy, can like treat a complex illness, when really you have to understand you have to understand more things in order to build resilience and to allow people to move forward, that it's not just about the symptoms, but the question is, how can we do more? I would actually say we actually should be listening and learning from what feels like a much more holistic view of how to treat mental health, instead of trying to put it in a box, like as if there's a cut and we put a Band-Aid. And I know I'm being a bit provocative that way, but I think and this is not to diminish what you're saying about specifically about Indigenous peoples, but I actually think that, I guess what I'm saying is I think the more like westernized medicine should be going back to roots and actually drawing from that. And I think that's part of the answer, like to your question as well, that all this judgment that's so constant in our society needs to be addressed.
I think that's a really good opening for other people who might also want to have something to say. Suzanne, did you want to say
Could I
something
just add
before I
something
open
to that?
it?
I think those are really important points at the sort of the micro level of the interaction of what happens. But when you look at it kind of at the next level, the sort of contextual issue, when, let's say, a Native woman or a Black woman or a brown woman comes into a place and they have to sit down in this oppressive, power imbalanced situation with privileged people who are different to them and who have that innate power imbalance, no kind of healing is going to occur until Native people, Black people, brown people begin to feel less oppressed by the systemic way that Canada is built on racism. Mental health isn't going to get better. Because just going into an office, and if I walk into an office and honestly, I see a bunch of white people there with their clipboards and their coats and them telling me, this is what's wrong with you, I just want to shrink and run out of there. When I go into emergency room because one of my kids got hurt, oh, who's your social worker? Do you smoke in the house? I'm like, no. Do you know who I am? No, I don't say that, but I feel like saying that. But I don't. But they think automatically because I'm a Native woman, I have all these problems. And they, was alcohol involved? Was anybody drinking? Who's your social worker? I don't have a social worker. Are you sure? That this isn't like a funny thing. This is something that happens every day. Because if you're not white in Canada, you can forget any kind of regular treatment that everyone else takes for granted.
Well, I think that those comments have resonated with our audience, who I think are probably burning with questions for each of you. We do have mics on the side, so if you have a question, could you raise your hand and we'll make sure a mic is brought to you. Third row, second row, there's one in each.
My concern is really in tandem with Dr.
Suzanne.
Thank you so much for your powerful, it's really moving. And I'm particularly concerned, I came in a little bit late, but when Dr. Amanda was doing her presentation on stigma. And really, my concern is there's this tendency to use this universalist approach towards stigma, which homogenizes experiences that women have with mental illness, the experience that they have with mental illness. They tend to homogenize it. But particularly, I'm concerned because, as Dr. Suzanne here was explaining, Black women, First Nation Native women, Indigenous women in Canada, experience mental illness in a different way, and the stigma as well, specifically related along not only cultural line, but also the Western European model of diagnosing illness and all the stereotypes that come along as well with being Black, being an Indigenous woman. So this is what I want to, I'm really particularly concerned about this when addressing stigma, that we don't see all women experiences, lump them into one, but to understand the historical relations that come along as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for your comment. Are there questions? Is it just behind you? Thank you.
Just to add to what you're saying, it's the historical piece, but it's the current piece, that the current aspect of that is the problem. We can't change what happened in the past. We can't change the Indian Act from the past. We can't change all of these other like racist immigration policies that Canada's had, but we can change what we're doing now. And it's what we're doing now that we have the power to change, by acknowledging that these problems exist and creating strategies to try to address them, which is not the colored people's problem to deal with. It's the system's problem to deal with.
Thank you.
Thank you. Further to that point, so my family has been involved in mental health fundraising for about 17 years. We lost my brother to suicide. And from that very early age, when I was 15, I struggled tremendously with this idea that suicide, when we talk about it, or mental health as sort of like this equalizer, was somehow going to open up the conversation and make it better, when it was so obvious to me that it was systemic, that it is cultural, like cultural in the sense that it's not, it doesn't happen in a vacuum, divorced from race, gender, class, all of these things. And so I struggled for many, many years of like, how do we actually make a difference? And where I'm at right now is I'm working on this initiative called Art Not Shame, because what I'm hearing a lot of the time, and I don't know if I'm wrong or if this is supported by evidence, is that we're actually a very shame-based culture. And again, shame doesn't exist in a vacuum. Shame is very much contingent on these sort of historical traumas, current race and class and gender relations. And so, and also, imbued in the stories we tell each other about each other. And so sort of always trying to figure out what this tension is between treating people on an individual level, but also being very aware of this sort of societal, systemic stuff that feeds into it. And so I just wondered what your thoughts are maybe on that idea of shame, and if we were to bring that also into the conversation, if it might open up sort of holding those things in tension. I don't know if that's a very clear question, but.
Do we have a short answer to a big question?
Yeah, I think shame ultimately means we don't talk. We don't have a conversation, and we don't have language when we want to talk to have a conversation about mental health and mental illness and what it means and how it intersects with all these other aspects of diversity. So yeah, shame keeps us quiet. So I think part of the solution, and what Simone was talking about earlier, is changing the conversation, but also helping people, giving people language to talk about this, and giving people space to have a platform and to have a voice. People with lived experience and people from other marginalized sectors of our population, making a space for them to talk. So that we can have some action. I guess the other piece, if I can mention quickly, we spend a lot of money on anti-stigma initiatives to try to change attitudes. There is not a lot of corresponding funds for actually changing the social and economic position of those marginalized individuals. So we need both of those pieces. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to thank our panelists and encourage you all to keep the conversation going in the breaks, the networking events, and over lunch. So Paula?